The house stood wide and white beneath the heavy southern sky, its columns rising like monuments to permanence. From a distance it suggested order, gentility, even grace, but before the sun crested the fields and before the master's children stirred beneath linen sheets, she was already awake. Her day began in darkness. The floorboards were cold beneath her bare feet, as she moved silently through corridors that were not hers, carrying water, kindling, and the weight of another family's expectations. The ledgers that recorded the plantation's wealth listed livestock, acreage, tools, and her. Her name was reduced to ink beside a dollar amount. Yet inside the nursery upstairs, she was the first voice the children heard and the last shadow they saw before sleep. She had once had another name, one spoken by a mother whose face she could no longer clearly recall. That name did not survive the crossing, nor the auction block, nor the new surname imposed upon her. On the plantation in South Carolina, she became what they needed her to be: a pair of steady hands, a full breast, a watchful presence in the nursery. The mistress, pale and often confined to bed after childbirth, entrusted her with the fragile heirs swaddled in lace. Trust in this house was not freedom, it was obligation enforced by threat. The same arms that cradled the infant could be whipped for the smallest perceived failure. Before dawn, she would stir the coals in the kitchen hearth, the faint orange glow lighting her face. She prepared broth for the mistress and warmed milk for the baby, though her own child slept in a cabin across the yard, tended by another enslaved woman whose grief mirrored her own. Sometimes her breasts ached with fullness before she reached the nursery. The master's child would latch first, her own would wait. The hierarchy of hunger was unspoken, but absolute. In the nursery, soft light filtered through gauze curtains. The baby would cry, small fists flailing against embroidered blankets. She would lift him gently, pressing him against her shoulder, humming melodies carried across an ocean she had never seen but felt in her bones. The songs were low and steady, threaded with memory. They were the only inheritance she could safely pass on, rhythms and fragments of language that did not appear in plantation records. The child would quiet in her arms. To him she was warmth, nourishment, safety. To the world outside that room, she was property. As the years passed, her duties expanded. The infant grew into a toddling boy with soft curls and curious eyes. He learned to walk by gripping her fingers. He learned to speak by echoing her words. His first attempts at language were shaped by her cadence, her tone. When he fell and scraped his knee on the veranda steps, it was her apron he clutched, her heartbeat that steadied his sobs. The mistress would praise her devotion in front of visitors, calling her loyal and good with children. Guests would remark on how fortunate the family was to have such a dependable nurse. None of them asked about the woman's own family. None of them considered that the devotion they admired was not freely given. Beyond the house stretched fields of cotton and rice, worked from sunrise to dusk by men and women whose backs bent under the relentless sun. She knew that her position inside the house, away from the fields, was considered a privilege. It spared her the worst of the physical toil, but it placed her in constant proximity to power, where every movement was observed and every mistake magnified. Inside the house, discipline could be swift and private. A broken teacup, a child left unattended for a moment too long, a perceived tone of disrespect, any of it could result in punishment. The intimacy of her role did not shield her from violence. It simply changed its form. There were nights when the master hosted elaborate dinners, the dining room filled with candlelight and laughter. She would carry the youngest child upstairs while music drifted through the floorboards. The boy would ask questions in the darkness, about the stars outside his window, about the stories she told him of brave animals and clever spirits. He did not yet understand the boundaries that defined their lives. To him, she was constant. To the world, she was invisible. In neighboring plantations across Virginia, similar scenes unfolded in parallel. Enslaved women served as wet nurses and caretakers, their labor sustaining the next generation of those who would inherit the system itself. The arrangement was cloaked in language of affection. Children were encouraged to feel attachment, even dependence, but the law made clear that attachment did not equal kinship. The bond could be severed at any time by sale, debt, or death. She lived with that uncertainty daily. Rumors of auctions traveled quickly through the quarters. A failed harvest, a gambling loss, a dispute with a neighboring planter, any financial strain could result in human beings listed for sale. She had seen it happen before. A woman she knew had been taken from the nursery one morning and sent west, her absence explained to the white children as a necessary change. The children cried for weeks. Then they adjusted. The woman's own children were left behind, their cries unrecorded. Despite the precariousness of her position, she cultivated small acts of quiet resistance. When she taught the boy his letters, she lingered on certain words: freedom, river, sky, allowing them to settle in the air. When she told him bedtime stories, she wove in lessons about kindness and justice, about the consequences of cruelty. She could not dismantle the structure around them, but she could plant seeds. Whether they would ever grow was beyond her control. The mistress sometimes confided in her during long afternoons, speaking of loneliness, of the burdens of managing a household. The conversations carried an uneasy intimacy. The mistress might rest her head against the chair and sigh, while the woman stood nearby, hands folded, listening. In those moments the lines between confidant and captive blurred, but never disappeared. The mistress could share her troubles because she knew her words were safe. The woman had no such outlet. Her fears and griefs remained locked behind a composed expression. Outside, her own child learned to walk without her. She would steal moments at dusk to visit the cabin, pressing kisses onto a small forehead, inhaling the familiar scent of her son's hair. He sometimes reached for her when she left, confusion clouding his face. Why did she disappear into the big house each morning? She had no answer he could understand. She could only whisper promises of return and pray they would not be broken by forces beyond her reach. As the master's son grew older, he began to notice differences. He asked why she ate in the kitchen and not at the table. He asked why her child did not live in the big house too. The adults offered explanations rooted in the language of order and tradition. He absorbed them slowly, the way children absorb the rules of any world they are born into. Affection did not automatically translate into awareness. The system relied on that gradual shaping of perception. Years layered themselves quietly. She measured time not in calendars but in milestones. First steps, first words, the day the boy mounted a pony for the first time. Her hair began to gray at the temples. She remained a fixture in the nursery even as new babies arrived and older children outgrew her lap. The house depended on her constancy. Yet her existence remained conditional, contingent upon her usefulness. Visitors sometimes remarked on how attached the children were to her. They laughed at the sight of a small white hand reaching instinctively for her skirt. They romanticized the image, the devoted caretaker, the contented servant. The reality beneath that image was more fragile and more painful. Devotion born of coercion is not the same as love freely chosen. And yet within the confines imposed upon her, genuine feeling did grow. She could not entirely close her heart to the children she fed and comforted. To do so would have required a hardening that might have cost her what little humanity the system allowed her to retain. In quiet moments alone, she wrestled with that contradiction. How could she love the child of a man who claimed ownership over her body? How could she separate the innocence of the boy from the authority he would one day wield? The questions had no safe outlet. They lingered in the space between duty and desire, between survival and self. The house continued to stand, solid and imposing, its facade unchanged by the emotional currents moving within it. To outsiders, it represented prosperity. To her, it was both workplace and prison, nursery and site of erasure. Her footsteps echoed in hallways she would never own. Her lullabies drifted through rooms that would never bear her name. History would later preserve photographs of the family posed on the veranda, children arranged neatly at their parents' feet. She might appear at the edge of the frame, slightly out of focus, a dark figure anchoring the composition. No caption would list her full story. No plaque would describe the mornings she rose before light, the milk she gave, the tears she swallowed. but in the private memories of the children she raised, her presence would remain. The scent of soap on her apron, the steady rhythm of her breathing as they fell asleep, the way she smoothed their hair when storms rattled the windows. They might struggle, as adults, to reconcile those memories with the lessons they inherited about race and rank. They might choose silence, or they might, years later, begin to question. In the early hours before dawn, as she once again moved through the quiet house, she carried more than water and wood. She carried a history that refused to be fully erased, a story of endurance woven into the daily rituals of care. The world around her insisted she was property. Yet each morning, in the simple act of lifting a child and whispering comfort into the darkness, she asserted a truth deeper than any ledger could contain, that her humanity persisted, even when the law denied it, even when the house that depended on her refused to remember her name. Motherhood, under slavery, was never simply a private bond between woman and child. It was a resource to be allocated, controlled, and exploited. On plantations stretching across South Carolina and Virginia, enslaved women's bodies were measured not only by their strength in the fields, but by the milk they could produce, the children they could bear, and the children they could keep alive, whether their own or someone else's. In plantation journals and estate inventories, there are careful notes about livestock breeding and crop yields. In the margins sometimes are references to a wet nurse assigned to the big house. Rarely is there mention of the infant left behind in the quarters, waiting. When the mistress gave birth, the household shifted into ritual. Curtains were drawn, doctors were summoned, prayers were whispered over a fragile white heir, whose survival meant continuity of wealth and name. If the mistress struggled to nurse or chose not to, the solution was already present within the enslaved quarters. A lactating woman would be called forward. Her ability to feed her own child became secondary to the survival of the master's bloodline. The decision was not negotiated, it was commanded. For the enslaved mother, the summons often came abruptly. One day she was nursing her newborn in the dim light of her cabin, counting his breaths, memorizing the curve of his tiny fingers. The next, she was instructed to report to the main house at all hours, her infant placed in the arms of another woman, or left swaddled in a crude cradle. Her milk, produced in response to her own child's cries, would now be regulated by the needs of another. The physical toll was immediate. Lactation is a demand on the body: calories, hydration, rest. Enslaved women were rarely afforded adequate nutrition for themselves, much less the extra sustenance required to nourish two infants. Yet the master's child would be prioritized. If the white baby cried in the night, she was expected to respond instantly. If her own child cried across the yard, the sound might reach her faintly through open windows, a distant echo she was forbidden to answer. In plantation records preserved in archives in Charleston, historians have found chilling patterns: higher mortality rates among enslaved infants during periods when their mothers were assigned to the big house as wet nurses. The data is sparse, often incomplete, but the implication is stark. When a mother's milk was diverted, her child's survival chances diminished. Starvation, malnutrition, and preventable illness followed. The system demanded sacrifice, and it did not mourn the cost. The emotional toll was more difficult to quantify. Bonding between mother and infant begins in the first hours after birth, through touch, scent, and the rhythm of feeding. To interrupt that process under coercion was a violence that left no visible scars, but carved deep wounds. Enslaved women spoke when they dared of feeling split in two, one part physically present in the nursery, the other straining toward the cabin where their own baby lay. Each time they lifted the master's child to their breast, they were reminded of the hierarchy imposed upon their love. Some mistresses convinced themselves that this arrangement was benevolent. They spoke of sharing motherhood, of trusting an experienced nurse to care for their child. They praised the enslaved woman's skill and patience, sometimes even expressing gratitude. But gratitude did not alter the power dynamic. The enslaved woman could not refuse, she could not negotiate hours, she could not demand time to nurse her own child first. The illusion of partnership masked the structure of compulsion. Within the quarters, other women tried to compensate. Grandmothers, aunts, older siblings, the community often stepped in to feed and soothe the infants, whose mothers were claimed by the big house. Sometimes another lactating woman would share what little milk she had. More often, babies were fed thin gruel or diluted cow's milk, substitutes that failed to provide adequate nourishment. Illness spread easily in cramped conditions. A cough could become pneumonia. A fever could become fatal. For the enslaved mother assigned as wet nurse, every report from the quarters carried dread. If her child fell ill, she might not be granted leave to attend him. Requests could be denied on the grounds that the master's child needed her more urgently. The message was clear. Her biological bond was subordinate to the economic and social priorities of the plantation. Yet paradoxically, she was expected to pour genuine affection into the role. A distant or resentful nurse was considered dangerous to the emotional development of the white child. Planters and physicians of the era wrote about the importance of warmth and attentiveness in early childhood. They wanted the benefits of maternal care without acknowledging the cruelty required to secure it. The enslaved woman had to perform tenderness while suppressing anguish. In some cases, the master's child grew to prefer the nurse's presence over that of his own mother. He would reach for her instinctively, cry when she left the room, seek her comfort during storms. This attachment could create tension within the household. The mistress might feel jealousy, even insecurity, yet she remained dependent on the very woman whose bond with her child she resented. The enslaved mother navigated this emotional minefield carefully, offering enough affection to fulfill her duties, but never enough to threaten the fragile pride of her owner. Meanwhile, her own child learned absence as a defining feature of life. He learned that his mother's scent lingered faintly on her clothes at dusk, but was missing at dawn. He learned to quiet himself when hungry, because crying did not always bring her. Over time, that early deprivation could shape a child's sense of security and trust. The damage rippled forward, subtle but enduring. The cruelty of forced motherhood extended beyond lactation. Enslaved women were also pressured to bear more children, increasing the plantation's labor force and market value. Their reproductive capacity was treated as an asset. At the same time, the constant threat of sale loomed over every family. A child raised to the age of 5 or 6 could be sold separately, fetching a price on the market. A mother, who had already endured the pain of nursing another's child, might then face the auction block separating her from her own. In legal frameworks reinforced by decisions like Dred Scott versus Sanford, enslaved people were defined as property, not citizens. This classification stripped enslaved mothers of any legal claim to their children. If a master chose to sell an infant or a grown son, the mother had no recourse. The law recognized ownership, not kinship. And yet, within these constraints, enslaved women carved out fragile spaces of resistance. Some found ways to slip back to the quarters between feedings, even if only for minutes. Some intentionally nursed their own infants quickly and frequently in stolen moments, trying to sustain supply. Others whispered promises into tiny ears, vows that they would remember their children's faces, no matter what happened. Memory itself became an act of defiance. The psychological strain was immense. To be compelled to prioritize another woman's child over one's own required a daily suppression of instinct. Guilt and resentment could fester, directed not at the innocent infant in her arms, but at the system that forced the choice. Enslaved women developed strategies to survive emotionally: compartmentalization, spiritual faith, communal storytelling. In prayer meetings held quietly after dark, they sought solace in the belief that a higher justice existed beyond the plantation gates. There were moments of unbearable irony. A white child, having grown strong on the milk of an enslaved woman, might later mock or demean black people, unaware that his earliest nourishment came from a black body. He might inherit the plantation, overseeing the same system that fractured the nurse's family. The intimacy of infancy did not guarantee empathy in adulthood. The ideology of white supremacy was taught deliberately, layered over early memories until affection was recast as nostalgia, rather than recognition of shared humanity. Still, not all memories could be erased. Some former slaveholders, writing memoirs decades later, recalled the women who nursed them with a tone of wistful sentimentality. They described them as loyal, loving figures from childhood. Rarely did they confront the cost of that loyalty. Rarely did they ask what was taken from the woman who had sustained them. After emancipation in 1865, the legal structure of slavery collapsed, but the scars of forced motherhood remained. Formerly enslaved women searched for children sold away years earlier, placing ads in newspapers, traveling miles on foot in hopes of reunion. Some found fragments of their families, many did not. The years spent nursing and raising white children could not be reclaimed. The milk given, the nights lost, the grief endured, all of it was part of a history that official narratives long ignored. The cost of forced motherhood was not confined to individual households. It shaped generations. It altered family structures within Black communities as extended kin networks adapted to constant disruption. It reinforced racial hierarchies within white families, normalizing dependence on Black labor while denying Black autonomy. It embedded contradictions into the very fabric of Southern society. White children nurtured by Black women taught later to believe those women inferior. In the quiet hours before dawn, when an enslaved mother sat in the nursery rocking a child who was not hers, the world might have seemed suspended. The baby's breathing would slow, the house would settle into silence. In that fragile stillness, she might allow herself a moment of private mourning, for the infant she could not hold, for the motherhood she could not fully claim, for the simple right to choose where her love was given. The tragedy lies not only in the suffering inflicted, but in the normalization of that suffering. Forced motherhood was woven into the daily operations of slavery, treated as practical, efficient, necessary. Its brutality was obscured by the language of care. But beneath the surface, it was a theft of nourishment, of time, of emotional wholeness. The truth endures in the stories passed down through generations, in the archival traces that scholars piece together, in the recognition that behind every image of a serene plantation nursery stood a woman whose own child waited in the shadows. Her body sustained two worlds at once, yet only one of those worlds claimed to value her. The other simply endured her absence, learning too early that love, under slavery, could be commanded away. The boy who once clung to her skirts would not remain small forever. Childhood, even on a plantation insulated by wealth and illusion, could not suspend time. Seasons turned. Cotton bloomed and withered. The nursery door that had once framed a toddler's uncertain steps would one day open to release a young man educated, confident, and increasingly aware of the power that awaited him. In his earliest years he had known her as warmth and rhythm, the steady pulse beneath his ear, as she rocked him to sleep. But as he grew, the world beyond her arms began to teach him different lessons. He first noticed the change in small ways. A tutor arrived, stern and deliberate, to instruct him in reading, arithmetic, and the history of a nation that called itself free. He learned about liberty and independence while living in a household that denied both to the woman who had fed him. He memorized passages about rights and property, absorbing without question the idea that land, livestock, and human beings could belong to a man by law. When he asked why she did not sit at the table during lessons, the answer was framed as natural order. She was part of the household, yes, but not part of the family. The law reinforced what custom suggested. In 1857, the decision in Dred Scott v. Sanford declared that Black people, whether enslaved or free, were not citizens and had no rights a white man was bound to respect. Though he was still young when that ruling was handed down, its implications seeped into the culture that shaped him. Newspapers discussed it. Neighbors debated it. The message was clear. The structure that placed him above her was not merely tradition, it was sanctioned at the highest level. Yet memory is not so easily disciplined. He remembered the scent of soap on her hands, the way she hummed when storms rattled the shutters. He remembered falling ill with fever and waking to find her cool cloth pressed against his forehead. In those moments she had not seemed like property. She had seemed indispensable. The contradiction lodged quietly in his mind, though he lacked the language to confront it. Adolescence sharpened the divide. He was introduced to the workings of the plantation, accounts, yields, negotiations with neighboring estates in South Carolina and Virginia. He accompanied his father to inspect the fields, observing rows of laboring bodies bent under the sun. The men and women he saw there were categorized by productivity, by discipline, by potential resale value. Among them were relatives of the woman who had raised him. He was taught to see them as units of labor first, people second. Inside the house, her role subtly shifted. As he outgrew the nursery, he required her less for daily care. She remained present, supervising younger siblings, managing household tasks, but the intimacy of infancy receded into memory. He addressed her with the same familiar title he had used as a child, a word that sounded affectionate, yet carried within it the assumption of hierarchy. He did not question why she aged more quickly than his mother, why her hands bore calluses that his never would. When he left for schooling, perhaps in a distant town, the separation introduced distance not only of miles, but of perception. Among peers from similar families, he encountered a shared worldview that normalized slavery as economic necessity and social foundation. The women who had nursed and raised them were recalled with nostalgia, described as loyal fixtures of childhood. Rarely did those conversations venture into the conditions that defined those women's lives. The brutality that undergirded the system was kept at the edges of polite discourse. Returning home as a young man, he stepped into authority more fully. His father began delegating responsibilities, overseeing work schedules, reviewing accounts, disciplining those deemed insubordinate. The first time he was required to enforce punishment, perhaps ordering a whipping for a man accused of theft or defiance, a line was crossed. The boy who had once clung to a black woman for comfort now stood as representative of a structure that terrorized her community. Whether he hesitated or acted decisively, the transformation was complete in the eyes of those who watched. And she watched. From doorways, from the edge of the yard, she observed the child she had nurtured become a man aligned with the machinery of slavery. Pride in his growth mingled with dread. She had taught him letters, corrected his grammar, encouraged kindness in small moments. But she could not shield him from the larger ideology that shaped his adulthood. The system was designed to claim him fully. Some young masters embraced that inheritance without visible conflict. They adopted the rhetoric of paternalism, insisting that slavery was benevolent, that enslaved people were dependent and childlike. They cited the supposed loyalty of nurses and house servants as evidence of harmony. In this narrative, the woman who had raised him became proof of his family's kindness, rather than evidence of coercion. Her endurance was reframed as devotion freely given. Others experienced quieter dissonance. Private letters from the era, preserved in archives and family collections, reveal moments of doubt. A young man might confess to a friend that he felt uneasy ordering punishment, that he could not reconcile the tenderness of his childhood memories with the violence required to maintain control. These admissions were often couched in careful language, constrained by fear of social reprisal. Doubt, like empathy, was dangerous in a society built on domination. As national tensions escalated toward civil war, choices hardened. Allegiances were declared. Young men enlisted, convinced they were defending homeland and honor. If he marched off to fight for the Confederacy, he carried with him not only the lessons of his tutors, but the imprint of her early care. Did he think of her when confronted with the rhetoric of states' rights and property? Did he recall the nights she had soothed him when cannons roared in distant drills? The record is silent on such internal reckonings. For those who survived the war and returned to plantations altered by defeat and emancipation, the landscape had shifted irreversibly. The legal foundation that once defined her as property had collapsed. She was no longer owned. The former master and the woman who had raised him now inhabited a tenuous new reality. He might address her with a tone of awkward familiarity, unsure how to navigate a relationship no longer codified by law, yet still shadowed by history. Some formerly enslaved women left immediately, seeking lost relatives or new opportunities. Others remained temporarily, working for wages in the same households where they had once been enslaved. Economic necessity blurred lines further. A man who had once been rocked to sleep by her might now negotiate her pay. The imbalance of wealth and land ownership ensured that power did not equalize overnight. In rare instances, adult sons acknowledged publicly the debt they owed to the women who had raised them. They might provide small pensions, allow continued residence on the property, or speak warmly of them in memoirs. Yet even these gestures often fell short of true reckoning. Affection did not translate into advocacy for structural change. Gratitude did not dismantle racial hierarchy. There were also those who chose amnesia. As Reconstruction faltered and Jim Crow laws emerged, many white Southerners reshaped the narrative of slavery into one of lost gentility and mutual loyalty. The image of the faithful nurse became a sentimental trope, stripped of context and suffering. In this retelling, she was content, devoted, almost family. The violence that constrained her choices was omitted. The children she had been forced to leave hungry were forgotten. But memory has a way of resurfacing in unexpected forms. Family resemblances, whispered rumors, and later genealogical research would expose complexities long buried. In some households, the lines between master and enslaved caretaker were blurred, not only by proximity, but by blood. The grown son might one day confront the possibility that the woman who raised him shared more than labor in his story. Such revelations unsettled carefully maintained myths. Even without such dramatic discoveries, the emotional legacy endured. A man in his later years might find himself recalling her voice more vividly than that of his own mother. He might dream of the nursery, of being held without judgment. These private recollections could coexist with public adherence to racist systems. Human beings are capable of holding contradiction without resolution. For her, watching the children she raised step fully into roles of authority carried a particular ache. She had witnessed their first smiles, heard their first words. She had corrected their mispronunciations and tied their shoes. Now she saw them sign contracts, give orders, perhaps even justify laws that circumscribed her freedom. The intimacy of infancy did not guarantee solidarity in adulthood. And yet the story does not end solely in betrayal. In some cases, the seeds she planted, stories of justice, examples of quiet strength, bore fruit in ways neither could have predicted. A grown man might one day question the system he inherited, influenced in part by the moral compass shaped in her arms. He might teach his own children a slightly different lesson, speak a word of respect where silence once prevailed. Change, when it came, was often incremental and incomplete. What remains undeniable is the depth of the contradiction. The children who grew up under her care carried within them the imprint of a woman the law declared inferior. Their earliest understanding of safety was rooted in the body of someone their society insisted was lesser. To reconcile that truth required courage many did not summon. In the fading light of her later years, she may have watched from a distance, as the boys she raised became patriarchs, legislators, soldiers, or businessmen. Some would defend the old order fiercely. Others would adapt pragmatically to new realities. All would carry, whether acknowledged or not, the memory of being held by someone the world told them they owned. History often records the names of the men, their achievements, their offices, their estates. The woman who steadied their first steps remains less visible in official accounts. But within the private architecture of their lives, she was foundational. The question that lingers is not whether they remembered her. It is what they chose to do with that memory, once they understood the system that had defined her place beside them. In some households, the truth lay not only in the daily intimacy of caregiving, but in something even more unsettling: bloodlines that crossed the rigid boundaries the law insisted were absolute. The plantation thrived on contradiction. It preached separation while permitting proximity. It enforced racial hierarchy while enabling private transgressions that would never be publicly acknowledged. Within that hypocrisy, enslaved women often bore children whose existence threatened the very structure designed to control them. Sexual exploitation was not an aberration within slavery. It was embedded in its logic. An enslaved woman's body was legally owned. Consent in such a framework could not meaningfully exist. Masters, overseers, and sometimes male relatives of the household exercised access with impunity. The consequences of that access were carried in silence, in pregnancies that could not be refused, in children born into bondage, in faces that mirrored those who claimed ownership. For a woman already forced to raise the master's legitimate children, the cruelty deepened when she was also compelled to bear his. In some cases, the resemblance was undeniable. the curve of a jaw, the shade of eyes, the texture of hair. Yet the law dictated that a child's status followed that of the mother. No matter how pale the skin, or how familiar the features, the child of an enslaved woman was enslaved. Blood did not override property. Inside the big house, this truth was often managed through silence. The mistress might notice the similarities but choose not to name them. To acknowledge them would fracture the fragile fiction of moral superiority and domestic order. Instead, distance was imposed. The mixed-race child might be assigned to work away from the house, or sent to another plantation entirely. Sometimes the master arranged a discreet sale, separating mother and child under the guise of financial necessity. The official record would note a transaction. It would not record the grief. There were also households where the exploitation remained hidden behind locked doors and late-night summons. An enslaved woman could be called from her quarters under threat, her refusal unimaginable. By morning, she was expected to resume her duties, preparing breakfast, tending children, moving through hallways as if nothing had occurred. The psychological toll of such enforced normalcy was profound. To nurture the master's legitimate offspring by day, and endure his violation by night, demanded a compartmentalization of self that few outside the system could comprehend. Generations later, the buried truths began to surface in unexpected ways. As genealogical research expanded and DNA testing became more accessible, families across the United States confronted revelations that oral histories had long hinted at. Institutions such as the Smithsonian Institution have documented patterns of racial mixing rooted not in romance, but in coercion. What had once been whispered in kitchens or denied outright now appeared in genetic markers and archival cross-references. Descendants of slaveholding families discovered African ancestry that could not be explained away. Descendants of enslaved families traced lineage back to the very men who had claimed ownership of their forebears. These discoveries did not create the history. They illuminated it. The truth had always been there, in plantation birth registers, in bills of sale listing children whose ages aligned too closely with the master's presence, in the subtle ways community memory preserved what official documents obscured. For the woman at the center of such a household, the burden was layered. If she bore a child fathered by the master, she faced a double bind. The child might receive marginally better treatment due to visible resemblance, yet that favor could breed resentment among others enslaved on the plantation. Alternatively, the child might be harshly disciplined to suppress any suggestion of kinship. Either way, the mother navigated a precarious emotional landscape. Raising the master's white children while secretly carrying his child in her arms required extraordinary restraint. She could not publicly claim what biology suggested. Instead, she watched as one set of children inherited land and privilege, while another, perhaps sharing the same father, inherited chains. The injustice was not abstract. It played out in daily interactions. The children themselves sometimes sensed what adults refused to articulate. A white son might notice that a child in the quarters shared his nose or his laughter. A mixed-race child might observe that he was treated differently from both white siblings and black peers. Questions could arise, but answers were dangerous. The plantation depended on rigid categories. To blur them was to undermine authority. In some rare instances, masters acknowledged their mixed-race children privately, arranging education or apprenticeships, even manumission. But such acts were exceptions that proved the rule. More commonly, the children of exploitation remained enslaved, their parentage an open secret. The mistress's silence was often strategic, preserving her social standing in a society that condemned interracial relationships publicly, while tolerating them when they reinforced white male power. The legacy of these hidden ties extended beyond individual families. They complicated narratives of racial purity that underpinned white supremacy. The very men who defended strict separation frequently violated it. Their descendants, generations later, confronted the irony embedded in family trees once thought straightforward. In the post-Civil War era, as emancipation reshaped legal structures, the buried connections did not vanish. Formerly enslaved women sometimes sought recognition for their children, hoping freedom might open doors previously sealed. Yet social stigma persisted. a mixed-race child, though free, still navigated a society stratified by color. Access to education, employment, and safety remained uneven. The emotional dimensions of these hidden family ties are perhaps the most haunting. Imagine raising a white child who carries your milk and your lullabies, while knowing that your own child, perhaps fathered by the same man, sleeps in a separate cabin, denied acknowledgement. Imagine watching those children grow into adults whose lives diverge dramatically due to the circumstances of their birth. The disparity was not accidental, it was engineered. Even within black communities, the scars of exploitation influenced relationships. Colorism, shaped in part by the history of forced mixing, created hierarchies that echoed the plantation's divisions. Lighter skin sometimes conferred marginal advantages, sowing tension and misunderstanding. The original violence reverberated through generations, distorting self-perception and communal bonds. As scholars and descendants piece together fragmented records, the pattern becomes unmistakable. Census documents after 1870, when formerly enslaved people were first listed by name, sometimes reveal clusters of surnames shared between white and black families in the same county. Property maps overlap with family stories. DNA results confirm what elders once hinted at cautiously. These revelations do not rewrite the past, they deepen it. They force a reckoning with the intimacy of oppression. Slavery was not only fields and whips, it was bedrooms and nurseries, whispered threats and unacknowledged pregnancies. It was a system that penetrated the most private aspects of life, and then demanded silence about what it had done. For the woman who endured it, the silence was both shield and prison. Speaking openly could invite retaliation. Remaining silent meant carrying the truth alone. Her resilience lay not only in survival, but in the quiet preservation of memory. She might tell a trusted friend in the quarters, or later a daughter who needed to understand her own origins. These stories, passed down carefully, became threads connecting past to present. When modern descendants stand together, some identifying as white, others as black, and trace their lineage back to the same plantation, the boundaries once policed so violently appear fragile. The categories that justified ownership blur under the weight of shared ancestry. The truth that emerged later is not merely genealogical, it is moral. It exposes the hypocrisy at the heart of a system that proclaimed racial difference as destiny while entangling bloodlines in secret. Yet acknowledgement alone cannot undo the harm. The woman at the center of this history lived without the luxury of public validation. She navigated danger daily, balancing survival with dignity. If she saw her child's resemblance to the master, she likely held that knowledge close, aware that visibility could invite cruelty. If she watched the white children she raised grow into adulthood, unaware of their half-siblings, she understood that ignorance was part of the system's design. The photographs that survive from the era often present orderly family groupings on plantation porches. Men seated confidently, women posed in structured dresses, children arranged at their feet. Occasionally, at the margins, stands a black woman whose presence is labeled simply as servant. What the image does not reveal is whether the children in the frame share more than proximity. The camera captured hierarchy, it did not capture truth. Today, when families confront these layered histories, reactions vary. Some embrace the complexity, seeking reconciliation. Others resist, clinging to sanitized narratives of the past. But the evidence accumulates, in archives, in oral histories, in the quiet certainty of genetic inheritance. The buried family ties beneath slavery's surface complicate any attempt to reduce the era to distant abstraction. They remind us that oppression operated through intimacy as well as force. The woman forced to raise the master's children may also have been bound to him by blood in ways she never chose. Her story is not only one of labor, but of violation, endurance, and the persistence of truth across generations. What emerged later was not scandal for its own sake, but clarity. The rigid lines drawn by law could not erase the human connections formed under coercion. They could obscure them, punish them, deny them, but not eliminate them. In the end, the truth waited patiently, carried in stories and cells, until a world more willing to listen began to hear what had always been there. When emancipation arrived in 1865, it did not come with ceremony to the quarters. There were no trumpets in the yard, no immediate transformation of circumstance. News traveled unevenly, carried by Union soldiers, by whispers, by rumor, long before official confirmation reached every plantation. For many formerly enslaved women, freedom felt less like a door flung open and more like a gate cautiously unlatched. The chains that had defined their legal status were broken, but the weight of years did not fall away so easily. On plantations in Richmond and across South Carolina, women who had spent decades inside the big house faced an uncertain question: where to go now? Land ownership remained concentrated in white hands. Money was scarce. Families had been scattered by sale and war. The same households that once claimed them as property now offered wages for domestic work, often meager. The roles were familiar: cooking, cleaning, raising children. But the legal framework had shifted. They were no longer owned. Yet power imbalances persisted, embedded in economics and social custom. Some women left immediately, driven by a singular mission: to find children sold years earlier. They walked miles along dusty roads, carrying scraps of information, a name, an approximate age, a plantation rumored to be in another county. Newspapers' ads placed by formerly enslaved people in the years after the war tell stories of mothers searching for sons and daughters separated before emancipation. Information wanted, they begin, listing fragments of identity, hoping someone might recognize the details. Many searches ended in silence. Records had been incomplete. Owners had moved or died. Children had been taken west, beyond easy reach. Others, particularly older women with limited options, remained on the same properties where they had once been enslaved. The transition from slave to paid servant blurred in daily practice. They continued to rise before dawn, tend fires, prepare meals, and care for white children, sometimes the very children they had nursed through infancy. The language changed. They were now employees. But wages were often tied to debt through sharecropping or company stores. The hierarchy of race remained intact, reinforced by emerging black codes that restricted movement, labor contracts, and legal recourse. The emotional complexity of these continued relationships was profound. A woman who had rocked a white child to sleep during slavery might now watch him step into adulthood in a world officially free but socially hostile to her. If she stayed on as a domestic worker, she inhabited a space heavy with memory. The walls held echoes of commands once issued as law. The nursery, perhaps repainted or redecorated, carried the imprint of nights when she had suppressed her own grief to soothe another's child. In the early years of Reconstruction, there was a fragile window of possibility. Federal troops enforced new laws. Formerly enslaved people voted, held office, built schools and churches. Some women seized this moment to redefine their roles. They negotiated wages more assertively, insisted on written contracts, sought education for their children. But backlash was swift and often violent. As Reconstruction waned and white supremacist groups regained influence, the safety net frayed. Economic coercion replaced outright ownership, but the effect could feel eerily similar. In households where she remained, her presence was often recast in nostalgic terms. White families, grappling with the loss of the old order, romanticized the figure of the loyal caretaker. They spoke of her as part of the family, emphasizing affection while omitting coercion. She might be invited to sit in the kitchen during gatherings, asked to recount stories of the children's early years. Yet when it came to inheritance, land, or true social equality, the boundaries hardened. Attending the milestones of the children she had raised became a ritual of quiet endurance. She might stand at the back of a church during a wedding, watching a bride she once bathed as an infant walk down the aisle in silk. She might prepare food for a funeral, grieving sincerely for a man whose first steps she had steadied, even as she remembered the system he once benefited from. Her mourning was genuine, but it was complicated by history. Meanwhile, her own losses lingered. If her biological children had survived the upheaval of slavery and war, they too were navigating a hostile landscape. Education was hard-won, employment opportunities were limited. Racial terror loomed in the form of lynchings and intimidation designed to suppress black advancement. A mother who had once been forced to divide her milk between two worlds now watched her grown children fight for dignity in a society reluctant to grant it. Graves tell part of the story. In many southern towns, white cemeteries are marked by ornate headstones detailing lineage and dates. Nearby, in separate plots or unmarked fields, lie the graves of black women whose labor sustained those families. Some caretakers were buried at the edge of the very properties where they had worked all their lives, their resting places noted only by memory. The children they raised might attend their funerals, stand respectfully, perhaps even weep, but public acknowledgement of what they owed her remained rare. Oral histories collected decades later preserve fragments of these post-emancipation lives. In interviews conducted under initiatives like the Works Progress Administration Slave Narratives Project of the 1930s, elderly black women recalled staying on with former masters because there was nowhere else to go. Some described genuine affection for the white children they had cared for, even as they spoke of the injustice they endured. Others recounted bitterness, the sense that freedom had promised more than it delivered. Silence became both refuge and burden. Speaking openly about exploitation, particularly sexual abuse or family separations, risked social ostracism or violence in communities still dominated by former slaveholders and their descendants. Many women chose discretion, sharing the full truth only within trusted circles. Their restraint was often misinterpreted as contentment by those eager to preserve comforting myths. Economic necessity frequently dictated compromise. Domestic work remained one of the few occupations available to black women in the South. The skills honed under slavery, cooking elaborate meals, managing households, nursing children, translated directly into employment, albeit under exploitative conditions. Wages were low, hours were long, yet within these constraints, women carved out incremental gains, insisting on Sundays off, saving small amounts of money, supporting community institutions like churches and mutual aid societies. The dynamic between former masters and formerly enslaved caretakers could oscillate between cordiality and condescension. A grown white man might greet her warmly on the street, recalling childhood memories, yet balk at the idea of her voting or sitting beside him in a courtroom. The intimacy of infancy did not automatically translate into adult equality. The mythology of the faithful servant allowed white families to honor personal bonds while resisting systemic change. As decades passed and Jim Crow laws codified segregation, the space for acknowledgement narrowed further. Public narratives of the antebellum South increasingly depicted slavery as benign, emphasizing harmonious relationships between masters and slaves. The figure of the devoted nurse was central to this story, presented as evidence that bondage had been gentle. The violence, the forced motherhood, the divided families, these were edited out. For the women who lived through both slavery and its aftermath, the distortion must have been jarring. To hear their lives recast as sentimental anecdotes required a swallowing of truth. Yet survival often demanded such swallowing. They had endured too much to risk everything in pursuit of recognition that might never come. Still, within black communities, memory endured more honestly. Stories were told at kitchen tables and church gatherings about the sacrifices made, the children lost, the strength required to navigate impossible choices. These narratives preserve nuance, acknowledging affection without erasing coercion, honoring resilience without romanticizing suffering. In the twilight of her life, the woman who had once been forced to raise the master's children might sit on a small porch of her own, perhaps rented, perhaps owned through years of saving. Her hands, once steady in the nursery, now bore the marks of age and labor. She had lived through bondage, war, emancipation, and the retrenchment of racial hierarchy. She had watched white children she nurtured inherit stability and security. She had watched her own children carve out space in a country slow to accept them. When she died, the ceremony might have been modest, a church service, hymns sung by neighbors, a procession to a grave marked simply. Perhaps one of the white children she raised attended quietly, standing at the edge, remembering the scent of soap and the rhythm of lullabies. Whether he understood the full weight of her sacrifice is unknowable. What is certain is that emancipation did not erase the asymmetry of memory, Her life straddled two eras, her labor essential to both. In freedom, she gained legal personhood, but not automatic justice. The silence that followed slavery was not emptiness. It was filled with unspoken truths, with griefs too heavy for public airing, with bonds that defied simple categorization. The woman forced to raise the master's children entered freedom carrying the imprint of years spent divided between households that were and were not her own. The chains fell, but the echoes remained, in the houses where she once walked at dawn, in the families who remembered her selectively, and in the communities that preserved her story more fully than any official record ever could. The truth did not arrive with a single revelation or a dramatic confession. It surfaced slowly, in fragments, in brittle letters tucked inside attic trunks, in courthouse records thick with dust, in testimonies spoken by trembling voices decades after the fact. For years the dominant narrative had been carefully arranged, slavery as paternal, plantations as orderly, enslaved caretakers as loyal and content. The image was repeated in memoirs, in monuments, in schoolbooks, but beneath that polished surface, another story waited. In the early 20th century, as the generation born into slavery aged, a fragile urgency took hold. Time was thinning. Memories that had been suppressed or shared only within trusted circles risked disappearing entirely. During the 1930s, interviewers working under the Works Progress Administration traveled across southern states, recording the accounts of formerly enslaved people. Many of the narrators were elderly women who had once labored in kitchens and nurseries, who had nursed white infants while their own children cried in distant cabins. Their words, filtered through regional dialect and the biases of interviewers, nevertheless carried unmistakable weight. Some spoke cautiously, aware that white listeners still controlled local power. Others, with little left to lose, allowed grief and anger to surface. They described being summoned to the big house at all hours, their bodies treated as instruments of service. They recalled the ache of hearing their own babies wail while they soothed another woman's child. They recounted pregnancies that were not chosen, children born into a system that claimed them at birth. These testimonies complicated the comforting myths that had taken root. Beyond oral histories, written records began to tell their own quiet truths. Estate inventory lists enlisted enslaved women alongside livestock and furniture, noting their age, health, and breeding capacity. Bills of sale documented the transfer of children with clinical detachment. In some cases, correspondences between planters hinted at anxieties over mixed-race offspring whose resemblance could not be entirely disguised. A line scribbled in the margin of a ledger, "Sent boy south," concealed a story of separation that only careful reading could reconstruct. As academic scholarship expanded in the mid-20th century, historians turned more deliberately to these sources. They questioned the sentimental portraits of the Old South and examined the structural violence embedded in domestic life. The figure of the devoted nurse, once celebrated in plantation lore, was reinterpreted through the lens of coercion and exploitation. The intimacy of the nursery was no longer evidence of harmony. It was evidence of proximity enforced by power. The truth also emerged through family reckoning. Descendants of slaveholding families, tracing genealogies once assumed straightforward, encountered gaps and inconsistencies. DNA testing, increasingly accessible in the 21st century, introduced scientific confirmation to long-suspected connections. White families discovered African ancestry linked to specific plantations. Black families uncovered paternal lines, leading back to men recorded as owners. Institutions such as the Smithsonian Institution documented these patterns, situating personal revelations within a broader historical context. For many, the discoveries were disorienting. The woman remembered in family lore as "our old nurse" was no longer a benign figure of childhood nostalgia. She became a person with a name, with children of her own, with a life circumscribed by laws that denied her autonomy. The affectionate stories of loyalty now coexisted with evidence of coercion. Letters once read as sentimental took on darker undertones when placed alongside plantation records detailing punishments and sales. Communities, too, began to confront the buried histories embedded in landscapes. Former plantations transformed into historic sites faced pressure to tell fuller stories. Tour guides once focused on architecture and battle strategies now grappled with the realities of enslaved labor and family separation. The nurseries, once described as charming spaces where devoted servants cared for children, were reframed as sites of forced motherhood and divided loyalties. Visitors encountered not only grand parlors, but also cramped quarters, learning that the daily functioning of the estate depended on the unpaid labor of women whose own families were precarious. The shift was neither uniform nor uncontested. Some resisted what they saw as a tarnishing of heritage. They clung to narratives that emphasized mutual affection and downplayed violence. But the accumulation of evidence made denial increasingly untenable. The testimonies recorded decades earlier, the archival documents, the genetic data, together they formed a mosaic too detailed to ignore. Within Black communities, the emergence of truth often carried a different tone. For many, these stories had never been entirely hidden. They had been passed down in kitchens and churches, preserved through oral tradition when official records omitted them. What changed was the broader acknowledgement. The pain that had once been borne quietly gained public recognition. The woman forced to raise the master's children was no longer a footnote. She was central to understanding the era. Artists and writers contributed to this reckoning. Novels, films, and visual art explored the psychological complexity of enslaved caretakers, giving interiority to figures long flattened into stereotypes. The trope of the mammy, once romanticized in popular culture, was interrogated and dismantled. Audiences were invited to see beyond caricature, to consider the cost of the smile that history had demanded. Educational curricula evolved, albeit unevenly. Textbooks began to include discussions of enslaved women's reproductive exploitation and the ways in which slavery penetrated domestic life. Students learned that the system was not confined to fields and markets, but extended into bedrooms and nurseries. The truth that emerged was not simply about cruelty. It was about contradiction, about how intimacy and oppression coexisted, how love could be both genuine and constrained by force. For descendants of the women themselves, the process of uncovering truth could be bittersweet. Genealogical research sometimes revealed names long lost, connecting families separated by sale. Reunions were organized between branches of families divided by race and status generations earlier. These encounters were layered with emotion, grief for what had been stolen, curiosity about shared ancestry, cautious hope for reconciliation. The past could not be undone, but it could be acknowledged. Memorialization played a role as well. Plaques and monuments began to honor the lives of enslaved women whose labor sustained entire regions. Cemeteries were restored, graves once unmarked identified through research and community effort. Ceremonies were held where silence had reigned. In speaking their names aloud, communities countered centuries of erasure. Yet the emergence of truth also exposed enduring inequities. The economic foundations built on enslaved labor had generated wealth passed down through white families for generations. The women whose bodies and milk had nourished that wealth received no compensation. The reckoning, therefore, extended beyond acknowledgement into debates about reparative justice. Conversations about inheritance, land, and systemic inequality gained new urgency when framed within the intimate realities of forced motherhood and sexual exploitation. The emotional dimension of this reckoning is perhaps the most profound. To confront the full story requires holding multiple truths at once. That affection existed within constrained circumstances. That children can genuinely love caregivers, even within unjust systems. That survival sometimes demanded compromises misread by outsiders. The woman forced to raise the master's children was neither saint nor stereotype. She was a human being navigating an inhuman structure. As archives continue to be digitized and stories shared widely, the narrative grows more nuanced. Scholars cross-reference plantation logs with census data, tracing lives across decades. Descendants upload family trees and compare DNA results, filling gaps once considered permanent. Each new piece of information adds depth to a story long flattened. The truth that emerged later did not diminish the suffering of the past. It illuminated it. It challenged the comfort of myths and demanded a more honest accounting. It insisted that the nursery be recognized as a site of labor and loss, not merely of tender memory. It reframed the image of the devoted caretaker as a testament to resilience under coercion, rather than evidence of contentment. In the end, the reckoning is ongoing. History is not static. It is continually revised as new evidence and perspectives surface. The woman once recorded as property now stands, in scholarship and public memory, as central to understanding slavery's human cost. Her divided motherhood, her endurance, her quiet acts of resistance, these are no longer peripheral